The knock at the door. The blizzard outside roared like an angry beast, its icy breath rattling against the windows of Thomas Whitaker's isolated home. Snow piled high against the porch, swirling in chaotic patterns under the dim glow of the flickering porch light. The world beyond his doorstep was a frozen wasteland, a storm-ravaged abyss where no man, let alone a child, should have been wandering. Inside, Thomas sat in his worn-out armchair, a tattered quilt draped over his lap, his tired eyes fixed on the dying embers in the fireplace. A half-empty glass of whiskey rested on the side table, untouched for the past hour. He wasn't drinking tonight, despite the dull ache of loneliness pressing against his chest. He was simply thinking, lost in a sea of memories, some warm, others unbearably cold. It was Christmas Eve, a night that once filled his house with laughter and love, but now only deepened the void that had been left behind. The last time this house had been truly alive was years ago, when Margaret was still here, when their son Daniel was small, when life had been simple. But Margaret had been gone for nearly a decade now, and Daniel, well, Daniel had a family of his own. One that had no room for an old man lost in his grief. The clock on the wall chimed 9. Thomas exhaled slowly, rubbing his weathered hands together. The warmth from the fire barely reached his bones these days. The house was too big, too empty, too quiet. Maybe it's time, he thought. Time to move. Time to sell the house. Time to stop waiting for something, someone, who wasn't coming back. Then, all at once, the stillness was shattered. A desperate knock pounded against the door. Thomas froze. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it, a trick of the wind slamming loose branches against the walls. But then it came again, louder, faster, frantic. His heart began to pound. No one ever came here, especially not in a storm like this. His closest neighbor was nearly 2 miles away, and the roads had been impassable since early afternoon. Was it someone lost? A stranded traveler? Or was it something worse? His instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but something deeper, something human, forced his stiff legs to move. He grabbed the shotgun from beside the door, just in case, and peered through the peephole. But what he saw stopped his heart cold. 2 tiny figures stood outside in the swirling snow. Children. He yanked the door open without thinking, and the wind immediately attacked him, sending a blast of frozen air into the house. Snowflakes stung his face as his gaze fell upon the 2 little girls standing on his porch. They were twins, no older than 7 or 8. Barefoot. Trembling. Their nightgowns, thin, soaked, clinging to their frail bodies, were nowhere near enough to protect them from the unforgiving cold. Their long, tangled hair whipped wildly in the wind, their cheeks red from the biting frost. They were holding onto each other, their tiny hands clasped in silent prayer as if the only thing keeping them standing was each other's warmth. And then, one of them collapsed into the snow. A strangled gasp escaped the other girl's lips as she tried to hold her sister up, but she was too weak. Her blue lips trembled as she whispered something Thomas couldn't hear over the storm. He didn't think, he acted. He lunged forward, scooping both girls into his arms, their bodies light as feathers. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. What in God's name? He rushed them inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The warmth hit them immediately, but the girls didn't react. Their small bodies shuddered violently against his chest, their limbs stiff, their breaths shallow. Stay with me, Thomas murmured as he carried them toward the fire. He gently laid them down on the old fur rug, grabbing the thickest blankets he could find. He wrapped one around each of them, rubbing their arms and legs, trying to coax warmth back into their tiny bodies. One of the girls let out a weak, pained whimper. The other still hadn't moved. Thomas's chest tightened. Who were they? Where had they come from? His eyes darted back to the front door. There had been no tracks leading up to the porch when he opened it, only snowdrifts and the untouched, endless white of the blizzard. How had they gotten here? His hands, rough and shaking, pushed damp hair from one of the girls' faces, his breath catching at the sight. For a brief moment, it felt like time had ripped apart, like the past and present had folded into each other. Because staring up at him, even through half-closed, feverish eyes, was a face he had seen before. A face that couldn't, be here. His daughter's face. The daughter he had buried 25 years ago. Thomas's vision blurred. His chest clenched so tightly it hurt. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the fire's soft crackling. His mind scrambled for explanations. Coincidence. A trick of the light. A cruel joke played by fate. But then, as if hearing his unspoken questions, the girl stirred. Her small, frozen hand reached for his wrist, gripping it weakly. And then, in a whisper so soft it barely reached his ears, she spoke the words that changed everything. Please, don't let him find us." Thomas's breath hitched. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Who?" he asked hoarsely, leaning closer. "Who's after you?" The girl's grip tightened. "The man," she whispered, eyes fluttering closed again. "The man with the black coat." A sudden gust of wind rattled the house, and Thomas swore he heard something beyond it. A distant sound. A voice. And then a shadow passed outside the window. The man in the black coat. The wind howled through the trees, slamming against the windows with unrelenting force. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Thomas sat frozen on the floor, his breath uneven, his heart hammering in his chest. The girl's whispered words echoed in his mind. The man with the black coat. Outside, beyond the swirling snow, something moved. A shadow, a fleeting blur against the frost-covered window. Thomas didn't move. He barely breathed. His grip on the nearest blanket tightened as his eyes locked onto the glass, searching, watching. Was it the storm playing tricks on his tired eyes? Or had someone really been out there? The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. He turned his gaze back to the girls. The one who had spoken, her face was eerily familiar, so much so that it felt like an old wound had been ripped open inside him. She had fallen unconscious again, her breath shallow, her sister curled up beside her. The girls were barely hanging on. Thomas knew he didn't have much time. Whatever their story was, whoever had left them out there, didn't matter right now. What mattered was keeping them alive. Shoving his unease aside, he moved quickly, gathering supplies. He ran to the kitchen and grabbed a clean towel, wetting it slightly with warm water before returning to the girls. Carefully, he dabbed at their pale, frostbitten skin, his hands working gently but urgently. "Come on, little one," he murmured, his voice rough. "Stay with me." He unwrapped their soaked nightgowns and replaced them with thick, dry flannel shirts from his closet. The fabric practically swallowed them whole, but at least they wouldn't freeze. He tucked the heavy blankets around them, pulling them closer to the fire. As he worked, his mind raced. Who were they? Where had they come from? And more importantly, who were they running from? Thomas had seen plenty of things in his long life. He had fought in wars, built his home with his own hands, buried people he had loved. But this was different. This was something he didn't understand. Because nothing about these girls made sense. And then, the knock came again. A slow, deliberate pounding against the door. Thomas went still. This knock was different from the frantic one before. This was measured. Heavy. Someone was here. His grip tightened around the shotgun still resting against the side of his chair. He turned his head toward the window, listening. The wind howled, rattling the house, but beneath it, he could hear something else. Footsteps. Crunching through the snow. A shadow moved again, just barely visible through the frosted glass. And then. Another knock. Louder. Thomas slowly rose to his feet. He didn't call out. Didn't ask who it was. His instincts screamed at him that whoever was out there was not a friend. A long moment stretched between him and the door, a moment so tense he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. And then, for the first time, a voice cut through the storm. "I know you're in there." The words were spoken calmly. Too calmly. Thomas's fingers curled tighter around the shotgun. A long silence followed. Then, the voice came again. "You have something of mine." Something cold slithered down Thomas's spine. The girls. His gaze darted to their fragile forms by the fire. Was this the man they had been running from? Thomas took a slow breath, forcing his voice to remain steady. "There's no one here but me," he called back. The wind shrieked outside, but he could feel the stranger lingering on the other side of the door. A chuckle, a low, humorless sound, filtered through the wood. And then. The doorknob turned. Thomas's blood ran cold. The door was locked, but the movement sent an unmistakable message. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just knocking. He was trying to get in. Thomas raised the shotgun, stepping carefully closer to the door. His heart pounded so violently he could feel it in his throat. "You take another step," he warned, "and you won't like what happens next." A long pause followed. Then, in a voice far too calm for comfort, the man said, "You don't understand what you've done." Thomas clenched his jaw. He was about to respond, when the porch light flickered violently. And then, without warning, it went out. Darkness swallowed the house, the only light coming from the dim embers of the fire. Thomas's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. His grip on the shotgun tightened. And then. A new sound cut through the wind. Not footsteps. Not knocking. But something else. A whisper. Not from outside. From inside the house. Thomas whirled around, his eyes darting to every dark corner, every shifting shadow. His pulse pounded as he tried to focus, tried to listen. And then, in a voice barely above a breath, he heard it again. A child's voice. But it wasn't coming from the girls. "He's already inside." Thomas's stomach dropped. He spun toward the twins, expecting them to be unconscious still, but one of them, the girl who had first spoken, was awake. Her wide, terrified eyes were locked onto something behind him. Thomas's blood turned to ice. And then. A soft creak came from the shadows. Slow. Deliberate. Someone was in the house. Thomas turned, shotgun raised. And the world went black, shadows in the firelight. Darkness swallowed Thomas whole. A crushing, suffocating weight bore down on him, his limbs refusing to respond. It was as if he had been pulled into the void, weightless, yet heavy with something he couldn't name. And then. A whisper. "Wake up." It was soft, almost pleading. A child's voice. A second voice followed, urgent, trembling. "Please, wake up." Then. A warm hand on his face. Small fingers pressing against his cheek. The touch jolted him awake. Thomas gasped, his lungs dragging in air as he fought his way back to consciousness. His vision was blurred, swimming with dark shadows and the dim flickering glow of the fire. The room was swaying, his mind still reeling from whatever had happened. Where was he? Then it all came back at once. The girls. The knock at the door. The man in the black coat. His body tensed. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs were sluggish, as if something had been holding him down. Then he saw them. The twins. They knelt beside him, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. One of them, the one who had spoken first, was clutching his hand. The other had tears in her eyes, but she remained silent. Thomas forced himself upright, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. His shotgun, gone. His eyes darted across the dimly lit room, searching for signs of the intruder. Nothing. But something felt wrong. The air was too still. The house, his home for decades, felt foreign. As if he were standing in the shell of something that had once been alive but was now empty. The door. His gaze snapped to it. Still closed. Still locked. His pulse hammered in his ears. That didn't make sense. Someone had been trying to get in. The doorknob had turned. The porch light had flickered and died. He had heard something inside the house. But now, nothing. Had he imagined it? Had he fallen unconscious before the door was even opened? Or? His eyes flicked back to the girls. "He's gone," the first twin whispered. The other clutched her sister's arm. "Not for long." Thomas exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "What the hell is going on?" Neither girl spoke. Thomas forced himself to his feet, ignoring the dizziness that tried to pull him back down. He staggered toward the fire, grabbing the iron poker from the side of the fireplace, his only weapon now. "Who was that man?" His voice was rough, his throat raw. "Why was he looking for you?" The girls didn't answer. Instead, they looked at each other. A silent conversation passed between them. Then, finally, the first twin spoke. "He wants us back." The way she said it, the sheer fear in her voice, sent a deep unease twisting in Thomas's gut. "Back where?" he demanded. The second twin looked away. The first hesitated. Then, in a whisper so quiet he almost didn't hear it, she said. "Back to the place where we died." Thomas went still. For a long moment, silence filled the room. He stared at them, the firelight flickering against their too pale skin, casting long shadows against the walls. His breath came slow. Measured. Because what she had just said, it wasn't possible. She was right there in front of him. Both of them were. Flesh and blood. Alive. Weren't they? Thomas swallowed hard. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "What did you just say?" The first twin looked up at him. Her eyes, so eerily familiar, held something deep. Something ancient. "We weren't supposed to leave," she whispered. "He told us that. He told us if we ran, he would bring us back." Thomas's grip on the fireplace poker tightened. His mind fought against it, against what she was suggesting, but the truth was already clawing its way into his bones. Something about them wasn't right. They were too cold. Their skin, pale, nearly translucent in the dim light, wasn't just from the frostbite. It was something deeper. And their eyes. His breath caught. He had seen those eyes before. Not just in a passing resemblance. Not just in some long-lost memory. No. He had seen them in someone he had loved. Someone he had buried decades ago. His stomach twisted. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't possible. But then. A new sound filled the room. Scraping. Outside. Near the window. Thomas's head snapped toward the sound. And his blood ran cold. A shadow, tall, unmoving, stood just beyond the frost-covered glass. Watching. Waiting. The man in the black coat. Thomas barely had time to react before. The window shattered. A violent gust of wind howled through the house, sending shards of ice and glass cascading onto the floor. The fire flickered wildly, nearly dying out before surging back to life. Thomas threw himself in front of the girls, raising the iron poker. His breath came in ragged bursts. But the shadow outside was gone. And in its place, a voice. Soft. Whispering. Right beside his ear. You can't keep them, Thomas. He turned, but there was nothing there. Just empty air. And yet, the presence, the feeling of someone standing right behind him, remained. The twins clung to each other. Their small hands trembled as they stared past him, their lips moving in silent prayer. Thomas forced himself to take a breath. To steady his shaking hands. Whatever was happening, whatever these girls were running from, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He turned back to them, kneeling so that he was at eye level. His voice was steady now. We're not going to let him take you. The first twin swallowed hard. You don't understand, she whispered. It's not just him. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? The fire crackled loudly. The shadows on the walls moved. The second twin finally spoke. They're already inside. And then, the candle flames blew out. Whispers in the dark. The room was plunged into near darkness. The fire still burned low, its embers pulsing like a dying heartbeat, but the candle flames, all of them, had been extinguished in an instant. No draft had passed through. No sudden gust of wind had swept across the room. It was as if something, or someone, had simply willed the flames to die. Thomas felt the twins clutch onto him, their small hands trembling against his arm. There inside, the younger twin had whispered just before the light went out. His heart pounded against his ribs. He forced himself to focus, to listen. But there was only silence. No movement. No creaking floorboards. No shuffling footsteps. And yet, something in the air had changed. The house no longer felt like his own. It felt invaded. Violated. And then, a sound. Soft. Almost imperceptible. Breathing. Not his own. Not the girl's. Something else. Thomas felt every muscle in his body tense. The breathing was close, too close, as if something unseen was standing right behind him. The girls were shaking now, pressing their faces against his side, too terrified to even look. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas turned his head. Nothing. But the breath, he could still hear it. And then, a whisper. Not a word. Not a phrase. Just a breathy, rasping sound, so low it barely made a noise. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. His grip on the iron poker tightened. His instincts screamed at him to swing, to fight, but against what? Nothing was there. And yet, the girls knew something he didn't. Thomas forced himself to speak, his voice quiet but firm. Who else is in this house? For a long moment, neither of them answered. Then, the first twin, Anna, whispered, the ones he sent. His stomach twisted. Who sent them? The second twin, Elsie, answered this time, her voice barely audible. The man in the black coat. A sharp gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but Thomas barely heard it. He was staring at the girls now, watching as their frightened eyes darted around the room, as if they could see what he couldn't. His breath came slow, steady. Tell me the truth. What exactly is he? Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Then, footsteps. Not outside. Inside. From the hallway. Slow. Deliberate. Thomas shot to his feet, shoving the twins behind him. The iron poker felt useless in his grip, but it was all he had. He turned toward the hallway entrance, his body braced for a fight, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps had stopped. The only sound was the crackling fire and the ragged breathing of the girls. Thomas took a cautious step forward. The floorboard beneath him groaned. He squinted into the darkness of the hallway, barely illuminated by the dying firelight. He saw nothing. But he felt something. A presence. Lurking. Watching. And then a new whisper filled the air. Not from the hallway. Not from the room. But from the fireplace itself. Low. Murmuring. Almost familiar. Thomas's blood turned to ice. The flames flickered, stretching unnaturally high for a moment, and then a shadow moved within them. Not a reflection. Not the flicker of burning wood. A figure. Thomas staggered back, pulling the twins with him. The fire groaned, as if something inside it was pushing against reality, trying to break through. A voice, his voice, spoke from within the flames. "You left us, Thomas." He felt his knees weaken. "You left us to die." Thomas knew that voice. It was impossible. It couldn't be real. But there was no mistaking it. Because it belonged to someone he had buried decades ago. Someone he had loved. Someone he had failed. "Why didn't you come back for us?" The voice was stronger now, filled with sorrow, with accusation. Thomas's breath came in ragged bursts. He shook his head. "No. This isn't real." But the flames pulsed, growing brighter, blinding, until suddenly, they were gone. The fireplace, once roaring with life, was now dead. Only cold ashes remained. And in the silence that followed, a soft, familiar sound filled the room, a child's laughter. But it wasn't Anna. It wasn't Elsie. It came from the hallway. Thomas turned slowly. And saw her. A little girl, standing just beyond the firelight. Her dress was old-fashioned, tattered at the edges. Her face was pale, her dark hair tangled around her shoulders. And her eyes. They were the same as Anna's. The same as Elsie's. Wide. Glassy. Lost. Thomas couldn't breathe. His heart thundered against his ribs as the little girl took a step forward. "Daddy." His vision blurred. His hands shook. Because he knew that face. He had seen it before, in the deepest, darkest corners of his memories. It belonged to his daughter. The daughter he had buried in the snow. Decades ago. His throat closed. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the girl, his little girl, stood before him. Her lips trembled. Her small hands reached toward him. And then she spoke again. Only this time. Her voice wasn't hers. It was something older. Something wrong. "You left us, Daddy." The fire roared back to life, but this time, it wasn't fire at all. It was screaming. 100 voices, overlapping, merging, wailing. Thomas staggered back, grabbing the twins and pulling them with him. The house shook. The air grew heavy. And then the little girl smiled. The same smile she had before she died. Thomas felt something cold crawl down his spine. And in that moment, he realized. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't just ghosts or echoes of the past. This was something much, much worse. Because whatever had followed the twins to his house. It had been waiting for him, too, the forgotten sin. The fire roared like a living beast, its flames stretching unnaturally high before collapsing in on themselves. The little girl, his little girl, stood motionless in the hallway, her head slightly tilted, her expression frozen between sorrow and something else. Something dark. Thomas couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His dead daughter was standing in front of him. You left us, Daddy. Her voice sent a chill through his bones, not just because it was impossible, but because of how much pain it carried. Anna and Elsie were clinging to his side, their tiny hands gripping his arms so tightly he could feel their nails dig into his skin. They were silent, staring at the girl in the hallway with wide, tear-filled eyes. They knew her. Somehow, they knew her. Thomas swallowed hard, his mouth dry as dust. This isn't real, he whispered, trying to convince himself as much as the twins. But the girl took another step forward, her small bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. The fire behind him hissed. Something was wrong. The air was heavy, pressing against his chest like an unseen force. His skin prickled, and deep inside, a terrible realization began to take shape. This wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't just a memory. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for him. The girl's lips trembled. Why didn't you save me? Thomas's stomach twisted. His past was buried, long buried. The secrets he had tried to forget. The pain he had spent a lifetime numbing. And yet, here it was, dragged back to the surface. Anna and Elsie pressed closer to him, their small bodies shaking. They were terrified, but not of the girl. No. They were afraid of something worse. Thomas forced himself to take a step forward. You're not real. His voice was firmer this time, but his hands were trembling. You're not my daughter. The girl's expression didn't change, but the air around her seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt. Reality itself was bending. And then she smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that made his blood run cold. And when she spoke again, it was no longer in his daughter's voice. Oh, but I am. Thomas felt something shift inside him, something crack open. A memory. A buried, broken memory he had never dared to face. His breath hitched. His chest ached. The fire flared, the shadows around the room growing darker, stretching like grasping hands. You left us. Thomas's knees nearly buckled. No. No, no, no. It wasn't true. It couldn't be true. But the voice in the flames knew the truth. And so did he. And they had died because of it. Thomas stumbled back, shaking his head violently. No. That's not what happened. That's not. Liar. The whisper came from everywhere. Not just from the girl. Not just from the fire. But from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. The twins clung to him tighter, their fingers digging into his shirt. And then Anna, the quiet one, spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. You have to remember. His heart lurched. He didn't want to. But then. The room shifted. And suddenly, he was no longer in the cabin. He was somewhere else. And standing in the snow. The storm was brutal. His own daughters. The cabin was just up ahead. Thomas gasped as he was thrown back into the present. He was on his knees, his entire body trembling. The girl in the hallway, his lost daughter, stared at him with tears in her eyes. And behind her, draped in a long, black coat. And in that moment, Thomas realized. The reckoning. Thomas's breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts as if he had just been pulled from the depths of a freezing lake. But he wasn't drowning in water. He was drowning in his past. The figure in the long, black coat stood motionless behind his dead daughter, its presence stretching across the room like an invisible force, warping reality itself. The fire in the hearth flickered violently, as if it recognized the presence of something far beyond human understanding. Anna and Elsie clung to his side, their trembling fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt like lifelines. But neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. They had seen it too. Thomas knew that if he turned his head even a fraction, the air itself would shift, the shadows would stretch, and the truth, the horrible, gut-wrenching truth, would fully unravel. He was no longer alone in the cabin. They had come for him. The girl in the hallway, his lost daughter, his abandoned past, tilted her head slightly, her eyes shimmering with something unreadable. Not anger. Not sorrow. But something deeper. Something ancient. Did you think you could run forever? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it rang through the room like a church bell, shaking him to his core. Thomas swallowed, his mouth dry as dust. His voice cracked as he tried to form words. I didn't. You left me. The word struck like a knife. He had made a choice, long ago, in that brutal winter storm. He had clutched two small, freezing hands in his own and had to let go of the third. He had told himself that it was the only way. That it was the right thing to do. That it was survival. But survival had a price. And that price was now standing before him. The fire behind him roared suddenly, casting long, flickering shadows that danced along the walls. The flames whispered in tongues he didn't understand. And then, the figure in the black coat moved. It didn't walk. It didn't step forward. It simply shifted, its presence warping the air around it. The room groaned as if the very walls were straining to contain whatever had entered. Thomas felt his stomach lurch. He knew this presence. It had followed him for years. In the dead of night. In the silence of his thoughts. In the whisper of the wind through the trees. It had never left. And now, it had finally revealed itself. A cold wind rushed through the room, carrying with it the scent of snow, not the clean, crisp scent of fresh winter air, but the bitter, metallic scent of ice and death. The past had returned. And it had come to collect. 20 years ago. The blizzard raged around him, thick flakes of snow blinding his vision as he stumbled forward. His fingers had long since gone numb, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. He wasn't sure how long he had been running. But he knew one thing. He had left his daughter behind. He had felt her tiny, frozen fingers slip from his grasp, had heard her voice, so small, so fragile, pleading for him to stay. But he hadn't stayed. He had turned his back, clutching his other children to his chest, and he had run. Because the thing in the black coat had been coming. Because he had been afraid. Because he had made a choice. And choices, no matter how deeply buried, never stay forgotten. Present day. The air grew thick, pressing against his chest like a great, unseen weight. His knees buckled, and he nearly collapsed. The figure took another step forward, or did it move at all? The space around it simply bent, twisted, and suddenly it was closer. Anna and Elsie whimpered, burying their faces in his side. But the girl, his lost daughter, was smiling. Do you remember now? Thomas shuddered, gripping the twins tighter. Please, he rasped. Liar. The shadows stretched. The fire screamed. And suddenly, the cabin was gone. The wooden walls peeled away like smoke, replaced with the vast, endless whiteness of the storm from 20 years ago. The same blizzard. The same bitter wind. And in the distance, standing alone in the snow. A small, frozen body. His stomach turned. But his feet moved. He was walking toward her now, step by step, drawn forward by an unseen force. His lungs burned, his hands trembled, but he couldn't stop. The twins weren't with him anymore. The cabin was gone. It was just him. And her. And the black-coated figure watching from the storm's edge. The little girl didn't move. Her skin was pale, her lips a deep shade of blue. Her dress was tattered, and her tiny fingers were curled, frozen solid. She had waited. His throat closed. His knees hit the snow. And in that moment, he finally said the words he should have said 20 years ago. "I'm sorry." The wind howled. The storm raged. And the figure in black, the collector, smiled. Because the past never stays buried. And now, it was time to pay.